Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Very glad to meet you again in Ranadrill Weekly Podcast. In today's talk, we delve into natural gas business and especially the LNG, which played a crucial role to bridge the gap in Europe after the war took place in Ukraine by 2022. My guest today is Carole Nakhle. She is the founder and the CEO of Crystal Energy. She served also as a special parliamentary advisor in the UK on energy. In 2024, she was selected as the most influential CEO by London Business Consulting. Congratulations for making this achievement, Carole.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shaib. It's a pleasure to be with you today on this podcast.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is all mine. So let's start out our podcast from Europe. Based on the latest GECF reports, and during the first half of 24, global LNG imports grew by roughly 1%. Another report of the IEA showing that the LNG supplies are expected to grow by 3.5% this year. If we look at the Eurozone, the European Commission reported that the share of LNG in total gas imports was 20% in 21. But it's increased to 42% in 23. Dr. Carole Nakhle, how do you see the Europeans can balance between their commitment to be climate neutral by 2050 as they are tightening the regulations on carbon emissions, deploying carbon taxes? Let's mention ETS, emission trading system, and CBAM, time the LNG emits more carbon compared to PNG, noting that Europe carbon permit prices spiked from 23 euros to 69 euros per ton today.
Thanks, Shaib. Well, look, you're touching on a very sensitive issue, that is how do governments, and not just in Europe, but we highlight Europe because the EU in particular is perhaps the most aggressive region in its pursuit of climate change agenda. But governments everywhere around the world are trying to balance between achieving their ambitious climate targets and at the same time meeting the current needs of their population and securing energy supplies at affordable prices. So this is what people often see as contradictory, and we see governments, especially when they have a short-term mandate, because if you're talking about being elected for 4 or 5 years, for instance, it's very difficult to see you committing to targets you set for the next, let's say, 10, 20, let alone 30 years. So you can set very ambitious targets, but then the governments that comes after yours, then they may have to revisit those targets again. So this is a harsh reality that many politicians face. However, I would like to clarify one thing. The fact that the share of LNG increased significantly, as you indicated in your numbers, does not mean that the demand for gas in the EU is booming. We have to remember that for decades, the EU was getting most of its gas supplies in the form of pipeline and primarily from Russia. Then the war in Ukraine severed that relationship, and we saw Europe turning away from pipeline gas to another form of gas. So they substituted Russian gas by LNG coming from elsewhere, including, by the way, from Russia. So that explains the expansion in the demand for LNG, because if you look at gas demand in Europe, if you compare, for example, to the Asian market, the European market is more or less mature and actually has been barely growing. So the growth rates have been very modest compared, let's say, to a booming Asia. So in that respect, it's not that suddenly there is a big gap and there is a strong growth in demand that is going to be maintained for years to come when it comes to natural gas. There has been a shift in the supply and a gap created by the loss of supplies from Russia, by the loss of supplies of pipeline gas from Russia, and that gap was filled by LNG primarily and largely coming from the United States. And that said, so that explains the difference in the numbers, the growth rates in the demand or the imports of LNG. But at the same time, we should not forget that the EU is not turning its back entirely on natural gas. Yes, it's a fossil fuel, but in the EU taxonomy for what is sustainable project, what is a green project, they kind of provided some exceptions for natural gas and nuclear, by the way, because at the end, under existing technologies, whether we like it or not, the more expansion you want to achieve in green energy, the more backup facilities you need to have, and that backup has to come from another source. And the cleanest source that is available at the moment in terms of fossil fuel is natural gas. So I don't see the EU making like U-turns or shifting or sudden changes. It's relationship that has changed in terms of suppliers, but also a reality that the more they want to invest in green energy, the more backup they have to consider, and that backup can come from any other source, but the most suitable source at the moment would be natural gas, given its lower carbon intensity or carbon emissions versus coal and oil in power generation.
Yeah, perfect. Talking about natural gas and talking about the alternatives the European Union is putting on the table at the moment, is investing a lot in renewable energies. But talking about natural gas, we are all aware that natural gas is a fossil energy. But we need it, Europeans need it not only to generate electricity, but also for the petrochemistry, and which really taking a huge part of the business inside the European Union, and especially when we talk about Germany. So if we go to natural gas and we link it to the US, the production in the United States. So the US natural gas production was reported like 92.5 billion cubic meters last June. With this amount, it's taking a share of like 25% of global natural gas production. If we look at the export to the European Union, we see a huge and incredible uptick of LNG exports, passing from 27% in 21 to almost doubled. They are like 48% at the moment. So in the other hand, we see a decline in Russian share export combined, let's say piped and LNG to Europe, which represented like 42% in 21, but at the moment they are also only like 15%. We may agree, Dr. Carole, we might agree that Europe didn't suffer from gas outage, and the result, we see its stockpile at the moment is like 73%. But there is a gap of prices compared to the pre-war period. Dr. Carole, please, this is your question. If we see from one angle, we can say that Europe is paying the cost of the supplier diversification. But let's move further. You don't think that this is a long-term strategy has been implemented by the Europeans to get rid of fossils, including the ones coming from the United States?
Okay, so I have to look at it a bit differently, because I think the basic principles for energy security from the consumer's perspective is diversity, and diversity alone, as diversity of source of energy, but also diversity of trade partners. So I think what the war in Ukraine kind of accelerated the EU's pursuit of energy security, and by having a much more colorful portfolio of suppliers. And the US, of course, took advantage of that kind of growing market. But mind you, it did not suddenly happen overnight. If you look at the last few years, even if you go back to 2018 or even before that, we can see how the EU has been looking at the US as a potential, a huge helper for the EU in terms of looking for supplies coming from outside, let's say, the grip of Russian infrastructure and dominance in the European market. So in that respect, getting more gas from the US is a blessing for the EU, because it had to diversify its energy supplies. Add to that the fact that the US, unlike many LNG exporters around the world, their gas is not really tied into long-term contracts. They do sell maybe a small portion, but it's on the spot. It's been sold under short-term contracts or spot prices. And also it has the flexibility that other producers and exporters don't have. And that's why we saw before the war in Ukraine, there was a big chunk of US LNG going to Asia. With the war in Ukraine, actually Europe captured a big proportion of those of the US LNG supplies. Now, of course, if the EU pursues aggressively and manages to achieve kind of objectives related to climate change, that creates a threat for any competitor which is or any exporter which is relying on the European market. But remember, it's not like a static picture. There are lots of suppliers currently sending their gas to the EU, and the supplier who has an advantage in terms of cost, that will be the supplier that will be the last to leave the market, because we're not talking about a demand that is disappearing overnight. We're talking maybe about a shrinking market in the longer term, but it does not mean that everybody's going to lose out. Some exporters are going to lose out. Others might be better off sending their gas to other places, including burning it domestically. So we see, for example, many countries in Africa, they are struggling domestically with power outages, and they might be more sensible using that gas domestically. And at the same time, countries like the US, if their production and their cost structure, which puts them at an advantage at the moment compared to many other exporters, allows them to maintain the relationship with the EU, why not?
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very complex equation we see in Europe at the moment. So they are doing their best to get rid of fossils, but meanwhile, they have no choice at the moment because they increase the imports of LNG from the US. So if we link the European Union to United States, we have another threat. Let's say economically, talking about trade, a big threat for Europeans and United States, which is China. China in the last few years took profit of the discount on the oil from Russia, which enabled it to deliver many products with very competitive prices, which led the Europeans and the Americans to clamp down on the trade regulations on the Chinese product. The EV electric vehicles business was a headache for several European firms. So natural gas and oil and minerals are all integrated in the cars manufacturing. Dr. Carole, if Europe will succeed to generate big parts of its energy needs from renewables, how can Europe compete? China and India also. Same Europe is lagging behind them in kind of minerals and even fossils, coal, oil, and gas. So China, for example, hit a production of 230 billion cubic meters of natural gas in 2023, and it holds the biggest reserves of shale gas in the world.
Great. So again, too many aspects to cover here, but let me try maybe to zoom in on a couple, just given the time constraint. We have to think about the future as, and anyway, about energy markets, and also about what not just conventional fossil fuel, but also green energy, which takes me to mining and the supplies of minerals, not in a static way. It's a picture that is constantly moving and constantly evolving. And there are so many factors that come into play. Market prices or market signals are one of them, but we also have to remember there's also government policies can more than outweigh sometimes the market signals. And here I'm talking, for example, about investment. So maybe the prices in the market are not too favorable for investment, but this is when governments can step in and they can revisit the contractual terms. They can offer maybe some tax reliefs or some tax incentives or some fiscal incentives, and that can compensate for unfavorable market signals. So it's not like a clear cut or black or white. And we have to remember it's constantly moving, and government policies come into play, especially when it comes to the energy sector. And that's one aspect by which the energy sector is a bit different from other sectors because of the direct and heavy involvement of governments around the world in pricing in terms of some countries, and affecting investment decision and regulations, etc., you name it. Now, of course, when we saw recently, and this is normal. So we are focused about Asia, Europe in terms of gas competition because they are the biggest net importing regions in the world. So exporters will be focusing on those two regions. Any exporters will look at the Asian market and the European markets. The difference is that if you look at Asia, the share of natural gas is still very, very small in the primary energy mix and the power mix, unlike Europe. But Europe is a mature market. Asia is a growing market and has a huge growth potential. So in that case, the competition will continue, but it's not going to be that, it's not like a win-lose situation. Yeah, it's much more complicated than that. Sorry, go ahead. You want to ask me a question?
Yeah, this is the question. So Asian countries, especially China, it's a very rich country with minerals. Let's say most of minerals. China has the cobalt, has some minerals, and has even good oil production. It's producing natural gas. 2/3 of natural gas consumed in China is produced locally. So this is the advantage in putting China ahead of Europeans. So how
Not
this
necessarily, not necessarily, Shaib, because it's not whether you are producing it domestically or not, is that how much of that meets your domestic consumption. If your consumption is growing at massive rate, and remember that China has very ambitious plans to clean its power sector, to shift away from coal to gas. And as I said, the share of gas in the primary energy mix in China is a fraction of what it is in Europe. So even if you have those resources, and by the way, yes, China is producing, and even though they have the largest share resources in the world, they have not been able to exploit them efficiently because it's much more complicated, much more difficult than, let's say, in the US. So I don't believe in this notion that if you have reserves domestically, then you are fine. No, you have to take in consideration by how much your consumption is going, and whether maybe it makes more sense to import from other suppliers at a much cheaper, more efficiently than exploiting those resources domestically. So it's not, again, it's not clear cut as, oh yes, that China is at an advantage because they have those resources. They have been trying for years to exploit them, and they have not gone that far yet.
But they have also the advantage of getting energy, oil and gas from Russia with the discount price. So this putting also China ahead and enabled China also to compete the European Union. And we see how the European Commission is all the time blaming the Chinese for the electric the EV, which really half price compared to the car produced in inside the European Union.
But these two are a bit different. So we don't want to mix like what you can produce at low cost and the competition for gas supplies. And again, you see Russia has been turning east for a while. And I go back to the point I was saying earlier, they are not growing at the same speed. Yeah, Russia is turning to Asia because they are losing the market in Europe, and they did not lose it from the war in Ukraine, the start of the war. For long before that, Russia has been taking consideration a shrinking, maturing market in the EU, and they have been turning east to China. But China puts much greater emphasis perhaps on energy security than the EU does. And China is not going to put all its eggs in one basket. If anything, it is Russia that will come out a loser because they will end up depending more on a main customer, while China wants to maintain a diversity of trade partners.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a very, very, very rich content. Thank you very much, Carole. And allow me to go to the Arab world. I'm talking about the LNG in some Arab countries. So based on the latest report of GECF, during the H124, the MENA region's LNG imports increased by 37%. Let's say 37%. So even that power outage crippled parts of the Arab countries due to the lack of electricity and several factors. Among them, we have Egypt, Kuwait, Iraq, and Libya. In other hand, we see very promising natural gas project rising among some Arab countries. Let's say Saudi Arabia announced gas expansion progress for Jafurah project, targeting a gas production growth of 60% by 2030. ADNOC also made a final investment decision on the 9.6 MTPA Ruwais LNG export project. By the way, LNG project will have one of the lowest carbon footprint globally. I'm talking about the Ruwais one. The Algerian Sonatrach is investing $6.2 billion in 24 for the exploration and development of natural gas. Qatar also is increasing its LNG production from 77 MTPA to 126 in the upcoming 2 3 years. Dr. Carole, do you think that connecting the Arab countries with one electric grid, same as Europe, will allow them to alleviate the burden, which will save huge and large-scale investments in LNG, for example. Just say the imported LNG in these countries is mainly orientated to generate electricity in the peak demand.
Okay, so you put me here on the spot because what I'm going to say may not sound politically correct and some might be offended, but let's put it bluntly here. Let's be transparent and honest about it. First of all, how many pipelines, inter-regional pipelines you find in the whole MENA region connecting different countries to each other? Not many. In the Middle East, you find only one, which is, from Qatar to the UAE.
Yes.
And that's it. And that is quite disappointing because you would have expected that a region so rich in both oil and gas to have much more interconnection and in basic infrastructure of pipeline. That does not exist, let alone you want to move on to a grid whereby countries become even more dependent on their neighbors. That creates lots of concerns. And this is why, unfortunately, even though we talk about the Arab region is not one entity. We don't have every neighbor on good terms with its neighbors. Yeah, we find still disputed areas, some sensitive issues between one country and another. So I don't want to go down to the political fragmentation of the region, but we need to understand it in order to talk about more ambitious projects such as the grid connection. That said, if I want to talk about the savings for natural gas, there are perhaps much more lower hanging fruit, that are not politically sensitive. I mean, if you think about the region, they have massive reserves in the world, the largest in the reserves in the world, but they are not, their production is not commensurate with their reserves. So there's great potential there to give gas more attention. And they have started, but not compared to oil. So oil is much more established in terms of exploration and production because there's more rent, more value to governments, etc. But gas in recent years started to have greater attention. So that's one thing, to encourage more investment to exploit those resources. And quite often it may not be necessarily the national oil company that does that, because if you are an expert in oil, you may not need to rely also to bring in international capital for investment in gas. But there is another aspect. It is really shocking to see that many countries across the MENA region are still flaring more gas than it is the equivalent of what another country in Europe consume on an annual basis. So gas flaring practice is something very, very bad. And I think if those countries, like the countries of Iraq or Algeria and other countries in the neighborhood, tackle gas flaring much more seriously. And I know there has been some progress. I'm not saying that they have ignored that problem, but the problem is still there and still substantial. They can save a lot from that important natural resource, and they can reduce their carbon footprint. And there is the other aspect. So we're talking about the supply here, but what about demand? You look at pricing, domestic prices, they kind of are fueling domestic demand in a very inefficient way. As an economist, I always say that please remove subsidies. I know politically it's a very, very sensitive and delicate subject, but if you want to encourage more efficient consumption and a better use of your valuable resource, you have to consider pricing, domestic pricing. If you want to support the population, give them more targeted help, because subsidies simply end up benefiting much more the wealthier than actually the poorest. So there is a lot you can do, very well-known recommendations. So I'm not here reinventing the wheel. We can tackle those before thinking about something which can be more politically sensitive, given the realities in the region.
Yeah, exactly. If I see the Qatar, for example, which is producing like 77 MTPA of LNG, and it's planning to increase it to 126 MTPA by 27, for example. And we see there is an outage of electricity in Kuwait. There is a balance, let's say, inside Saudi Arabia. If we see there is a gap inside Egypt and time in Algeria, we have a glut of production of electricity. I think we need more combination, especially maybe we talk about North African by region, by GCC region and by North African region. I think we should have more combination between these countries, and I think we can really bridge the gap let's say, regarding natural gas, because talking about natural gas, talking about electricity, because natural gas is a very complex business and you need a lot of large scale investment. But I think for electricity, I give you an example. There is a grid now from Algeria to Tunisia, and Algeria is exporting like 500 megawatt of electricity to Tunisia. I think with the same example could be done in other countries.